Now let us discuss the last three COPs. This year there will be 29th COP, so we have to discuss the 26th, 27th and 28th COP. The 26th COP was held at Glasgow. It adopted Glasgow Climate Pact. Padho first point, go through the first point. So the first point is about net zero emissions. Now it says that more than 90% of the emissions of the world are now covered under net zero. The major emitters of the world, for example, US, European Union, they have given their timeline of net zero as 2050. China has given the timeline of net zero as 2060. And India has given the timeline of net zero as 2070. So when it says that 90% of the world's GDP and emissions are now covered under net zero, it does not necessarily mean that the countries have committed to go net zero by 2050. There are different timelines. India was heavily criticized at this COP. When India said that it will go net zero by 2070, at that time India was heavily criticized. So how do we basically justify India going net zero by 2070? There are two grounds on which we have to justify India going net zero by 2070. One is based on the principle of CBDR. What does CBDR say? That everybody has a common responsibility towards net zero in this context. Everybody is responsible for net zero. But they have differentiated responsibilities. They can't have equal responsibilities. They need to have equitable responsibilities. Had these historical emitters committed to go net zero prior to 2050, they had all the moral high ground to demand countries like India to go net zero by 2050. But if they themselves have chosen the most convenient timeline, because 2050 was given by IPCC, so if they have themselves chosen the most convenient timeline to go net zero, then as per the principle of CBDR, India is making a differentiated timeline. India, of course, is not as big an emitter as US or EU or China, and therefore India's timeline is lagging as compared to all these countries. So based on principle of CBDR, it gets justified. Second is that when India gives the timeline of 2070, of course we have commitments towards climate action. But along with that, India has got commitments towards achieving sustainable development goals as well. So whatever emissions at the country-wide level, our emissions are more of emissions of necessity. Therefore, India is trying to strike a balance between two of its international commitments, one of them being climate action and another being sustainable development goals. We are making the emissions for achieving SDGs. Rather, at this COP, India made a very, very brilliant statement. At this COP, India said that when India grows, world grows. Beta, we are almost 1/5 of the world's humanity. When India lifts people out of poverty, when India ensures food security for its people, actually it is 1/5 of the world's humanity which is getting benefited. Right? So the UN can never achieve sustainable development goals if India fails to achieve its sustainable development goals. Therefore, we are trying to strike a balance between two of our international commitments, that is climate action and SDGs as well. So these are the two grounds on which India's timeline of 2070 gets justified. The next one, Glasgow Leaders Declaration on Forest and Land Use. Land over here means soil. Land use, so it means soil. Both soil and forest are very important carbon sinks. They're very, very important carbon sinks. So for climate action, having healthy soil and healthy forest are critical. So basically this declaration is for ensuring healthy forest and healthy soils. The next one is Global Methane Pledge, wherein the countries have committed to reduce their methane emissions. Write down in the notebook. Methane is a powerful greenhouse gas. A powerful greenhouse gas with its global warming potential, 21 times that of carbon dioxide. Global warming potential, 21 times that of carbon dioxide. In brackets, write down over 100 years duration. Over 100 years duration. Next para. GWP is defined as amount of heat energy trapped by 1 unit of a greenhouse gas as compared to that carbon dioxide over a given duration of time. Therefore, GWP is the measure of relative warming caused by greenhouse gases. GWP is the measure of relative warming caused by greenhouse gases. Plus, one thing I would like to clarify. I have given everything as the handout doesn't mean that this is any less important. My reason of giving the handout is because it saves time on dictation. If I would have dictated all this content, it would have taken a lot of time. Also, it doesn't mean that everything is given in the handout and therefore you can be insincere and pay less attention to what's happening in the class. I find many of you not taking running notes. तुम्हें ऐसा लगता है handout में जितना लिखा है उतना काफी है. बेटा, अगर handout में जितना लिखा है उतना काफी होता, तो the teacher would not have been exerting for 2.5 hours to explain everything to you, right? So handout is of course not going to be sufficient. The explanations running in the class are important. You are mature enough to understand that running notes are very, very critical for these type of competitive examination preparation. So make it a habit of yours across all the lectures of yours, not just for my subject, but across all the lectures of yours. Now let us understand the concept of global warming potential. In the last lecture, I talked about these three greenhouse gases: carbon dioxide, methane, and nitrous oxide. Let's say we take 1 unit of each of them. 1 unit, 1 ton. So 1 ton of CO2, 1 ton of methane, 1 ton of nitrous oxide. Over a given duration of time, and that duration can be 20 years, 50 years, 100 years. So let's say we are taking the duration as 100 years. Over 100 years, the amount of heat energy which is trapped by 1 unit of carbon dioxide will be different from amount of heat energy trapped by 1 unit of methane, will be different from amount of energy trapped by 1 unit of nitrous oxide. And the amount of heat energy which is trapped is going to be proportional to the warming done by a greenhouse gas, which means more the heat energy trapped by a greenhouse gas, more will be the warming caused by that greenhouse gas. True or false? Yes, more the heat energy, more the warming done. So the scientists have been able to find out how much of heat energy is trapped by these greenhouse gases. Let's say X joules are trapped by 1 unit of carbon dioxide, Y joules by 1 unit of methane, Z joules by 1 unit of nitrous oxide. The scientists, they have a value of X, Y, Z. And then they have this value for 20 years, for 50 years, because over 20 years, 50 years, different amount of heat energy will be trapped. Now what they say is that to simplify this entire understanding, let's have a concept of GWP. To calculate GWP, carbon dioxide is taken as the reference gas. And the global warming potential of carbon dioxide is taken as 1. X can have any value, but that X joules is equated to global warming potential of 1. Now the scientists will compare Y with X and Z with X. Upon comparing Y with X, they find out Y is 21 times that of X, Z is 310 times that of X. If this is the case, can I say that over 100 years, methane traps 21 times more heat energy as compared to CO2? So global warming potential of methane becomes 21. And the global warming potential of nitrous oxide becomes how much? 310. So the moment I tell you this, what is your conclusion? Out of these three, which one is the most potent greenhouse gas? Nitrous oxide, followed by methane, followed by carbon dioxide, right? So methane is a powerful greenhouse gas, and therefore the countries, they decided to reduce their methane emissions. Please know that as of now, India is neither part of second point nor part of third point. We have not pledged anything under the methane pledge, and we are not even part of declaration on forest and land use as of now. This doesn't mean that we don't have commitments for climate action. I'll discuss those commitments. We are not under forest because we have an NDC related to forest. I'll talk about that nationally determined contribution. And we are not under the methane pledge because most of our methane emissions come from paddy farming, which becomes an example of emission of necessity for a country like India, right? It brings in livelihood security, it brings in export earnings for the country, and therefore paddy farming related methane emissions are emissions of necessity for a country like India. Then OSOWOG I already discussed with you. Turn over the page, 27th COP. 27th COP held at Egypt at a place called as Sharm el-Sheikh in 2022. So there was a fund called as Loss and Damage Fund, which was set up. First of all, understand what is loss and damage. Refer to the third para, underline, loss and damage refers to negative consequences which arise from unavoidable risks of climate change. Now understand, class. The countries right now have started with the climate action. The climate action may be insufficient. The climate action may still not be what is expected or what is desired. But still the countries have begun with it. despite the climate action being done by the countries, there are going to be some inevitable risks of climate change. There are going to be some unavoidable negative consequences of the climate change. These inevitable negative consequences of climate change bring about economic losses and damages for many countries across the world. And these type of unavoidable negative consequences are being called as loss and damage. So what become the examples of loss and damage? The rising sea levels. Despite the best of the climate efforts by the countries, we cannot contain rising sea levels in this century. The sea levels will continue to rise throughout this century. Coastal erosion will continue to increase. Submergence of many of low-lying coastal areas has become a reality. With all this happening, there are small island developing states which are going to be worst hit. The last boy, what are small island developing states? जिसने अभी पीछे मुड़ के घड़ी चेक की थी, I am asking that boy, what is SIDS? What are small island developing states? You were there in the last lecture? No, not you. You were there in the last lecture? Then why are you here today? The lectures flow in continuity. तुम पिछली बार नहीं थे, तुम्हें इस बार भी समझ नहीं आ रहा, मजा नहीं आएगा तो तुम घड़ी देखोगे टाइम कितना बचा है. You want to leave the class? नहीं जाना. But in the last lecture, I discussed with you what small island developing states are. Those are small nations like Tuvalu, Fiji Islands, Solomon Islands, which are very, very near to the sea levels. And some of them risk complete submergence by the end of the century. Now, these are the countries, least developed countries of the world, and small island developing states of the world. These are the economies which have had negligible carbon emissions. So we cannot club all the developing countries in one basket. India is developing, they are developing. But India is not comparable to these. India at least is the third largest emitter. We have till now consumed 3% of the carbon budget of the planet. But these type of countries have barely consumed 0.0000 something percent of the carbon budget. Can we compare them? No, we can't compare them, right? So these are the countries which have caused minimal damage to the environment, but the losses which they are bearing are very high, are disproportionately higher as compared to the damage, which is negligible, which is almost nil. So the rising sea level becomes an example of loss and damage. What else does it say is an example of loss and damage? Prolonged heat waves, desertification. Now what is desertification? Write down. Desertification implies complete loss of fertility, and ecological productivity of soil, over time. Now understand, class. Desertification means that a soil which earlier was fertile, which earlier was capable of plant production or crop production, this soil today has become completely infertile. Over time, that soil becomes completely infertile such that the soil loses all of its productivity. The soil has become completely unproductive. It's no more productive. So extreme form of infertility in the soil such that it becomes completely unproductive is what is called as desertification. And sometimes desertification again happens because of climate change. In sub-Saharan Africa, back in 1970s and 1980s, there was a prolonged drought. By prolonged drought, I mean the drought which stretched for 8 to 10 years. So it was a drought for a decade. And this prolonged drought was attributed to climate change. So sub-Saharan Africa back in the last century experienced a prolonged drought extending for a decade because of climate change. Beta, if the drought stretches for 10 years, will the soil completely lose its fertility or not? Of course, with no soil moisture, with no plants growing over there, the soil is going to completely lose its fertility over time. So soils which were earlier fertile, over that duration of drought became completely infertile. We call it as desertification of sub-Saharan Africa going back to 70s and 80s. So this is again Something which is, if this starts to happen, if drought stretches for a decade, it is an irreversible, almost an irreversible impact of climate change, unavoidable risk of climate change. Somebody asks me, ma'am, is desertification reversible? Yes, it is reversible, but it takes a very long time, right? Beta, dekho, question, if I just split up your question, simplify your question, you're asking me, ma'am, is it possible that a soil which today has become unhealthy, can it become healthy again? Can that soil revive? Everything in nature can revive if we remove the human activities. Nature has an immense ability to revive, to rejuvenate, if the anthropogenic pressures are removed. Right? तुम आज ह्यूमन पॉपुलेशन, कंप्लीट ह्यूमन पॉपुलेशन की एक्टिविटी को उसके 20% लेवल पर ले आओ. Within a span of couple of months, you will see signs of revival. If not complete recovery, signs of revival. Right? So desertification possible है reverse करना, but it will take long time. That's my point. The next example of loss and damage which is given is acidification of the sea. अब फिर लिखेंगे notebook में. Ocean acidification is defined as decrease in the pH of oceanic water. Decrease in the pH of oceanic water as it absorbs more of carbon dioxide from the atmosphere. As it absorbs more of carbon dioxide from the atmosphere. Due to human activities, oceans have absorbed about 25% of anthropogenic carbon dioxide emissions. About 25% of anthropogenic carbon dioxide emissions, which are responsible for increasing ocean's acidity by about 30%. Increasing ocean's acidity by about 30%. Now understand, class. You know that there is more of carbon dioxide in the atmosphere. You know that. Atmosphere and oceans are at an interface with each other. Water always has the capacity to absorb the gases from the atmosphere. If there is more of carbon dioxide in the atmosphere, then more of this carbon dioxide is getting dissolved in the oceanic water. And now when this carbon dioxide gets dissolved in the oceanic water, it leads to formation of dilute carbonic acid. Because of this dilute carbonic acid being formed in the oceans, the pH of the ocean water has started to decline. That decline in the pH of ocean water is being referred to as ocean acidification. The normal pH of ocean water is 8.2. Oceans are alkaline because of course rivers are draining their salt, so oceans are alkaline. With this happening, with ocean acidification happening, the pH has dropped to 8.1. So ocean acidification doesn't mean that the pH becomes less than 7 or tejab ban chuka hai wahan. Nahi. Oceans are still basic. They still have a pH more than 7. But the pH is declining, which is being referred to as ocean acidification. Understand the implications. Because survival of life becomes very, very difficult in acidic environment. So as oceans become more and more acidic, the fishes, the other marine biodiversity, their survival is becoming very difficult. Fisheries is an important source of livelihood for many countries, especially for countries like small island developing states and least developed countries. So when fisheries stock decline, it's an economic toll of them. It's an economic loss for them, right? So these are some of the examples of loss and damage. Now since SIDS and least developed countries are going to be worst hit because of these unavoidable risks of climate change, so it was decided that exclusively for these set of countries, there must be climate finance provided. And that climate finance is provided through loss and damage fund, right? So that's provided through loss and damage fund. I refer to the handout. At the 19th COP, which was held at Warsaw in 2013, the countries had formally agreed to set up loss and damage fund. Isko underline karo. So when was it decided that we will set up the fund? Back in 2013. And when was the fund set up? In 22. The fund was set up in 22. But when the fund was set up in 22, it was a zero account balance opened. Jan Dhan Khata. So it was a zero balance account which was opened. Then in the next year, abhi fir padhenge next COP mein, in next year the fund was credited with. Right? So that's the sequence of events. The next one, fossil fuels. The second point, fossil fuels. At 26th COP, there was a pledge to phase down coal power. There are two terms, phasing down and phasing out. Phasing out means complete elimination, phasing down means reduction. So at the 26th COP which was held in 21, at the 26th COP at Glasgow, the developed countries brought a resolution, and that resolution was that coal should be phased down. There are three fossil fuels, coal, oil, gas. There are three fossil fuels, coal, oil, gas. Out of these three fossil fuels, undoubtedly, coal is the most polluting one. Right? However, many of the developing countries of the world have a heavy reliance upon coal. Whereas developed countries of the world, their fossil sources are oil and gas. So now there is a new geopolitics which is emerging at these COPs around fossil fuels. And that geopolitics is that the developed countries of late have started to say that since coal is the most polluting of the fossil fuel, therefore coal should be phased down. However, it is going to economically hit the interest of developing countries like India. Because like I said, most of our energy production is from coal. Today, 48.6% of our energy production in the country is from coal alone. So half of our energy production is from coal. So at this COP, when initially the resolution was brought, the initial resolution was, or the initial draft was, that let us phase out coal. And India finds it very, very discriminatory that why to single out coal? If at all you're finally talking about fossil fuels, why not all the three fossil fuels should be discussed in the same breath? So India finds it very discriminatory. So now when initially the proposal was phasing out of coal, India took a very assertive stand against it, such that India said ki yaar, I'm leaving the table, kar lo jo karna hai. But these are negotiating tactics which are used by the countries. The moment the country says ki yaar, I'm leaving the table, फिर वो क्या कहेंगे? बैठ यार, बात करते हैं. अब उनको करवाना phase down ही था. They began with phasing out so that the country comes to the term of phasing down. So there was this pledge to phase down coal, but it is going to affect countries like India. Therefore, India finds it discriminatory. And now India at this COP, this is the new geopolitics. European Union had brought this resolution, but it was not European Union's idea to bring this resolution. It was actually US telling European Union to come up with this resolution, right? Because European Union's foreign, the most important player in Europe is none of the countries of Europe. It is US. So European Union does what US wants it to do. And US of late has started to say that these three, out of these three, gas is the cleanest of all. So use gas as a transition fuel. Transition matlab, one end of the spectrum is fossil fuel, another end of the spectrum is non-fossil. We can't move from fossil to non-fossil overnight, na? Energy transitions take time, take preparation, take funds. So you need a transition fuel which will help you to make the transition. Let this transition fuel be natural gas. यार है तो ये दोनों भी फॉसिल फ्यूल ही. ये कंबस्टन पर कोई ऑक्सीजन तो एमिट नहीं कर देते हैं कि प्राणवायु निकल रही है. फॉसिल फ्यूल ही है ना. तो मेरा फॉसिल फ्यूल पॉल्यूटिंग, तेरा वाला क्लीन. It doesn't work like this. It is going to help US economically. US doesn't do anything if it doesn't have an economic interest into it. US knows that countries like India do not have sufficient reserves of oil and gas, which means that our import dependence on oil is high, our import dependence upon gas will increase as well. Yeah, coal, to after all, we are the second largest producer of coal in the world. We have coal reserves. But if we switch from coal to these two, then our import bills are going to increase a lot. It's going to cost our exchequer. Right? So, ये वाला जो point है, this is the new geopolitics which is emerging at these COPs now, revolving around the fossil fuels. So that point, fossil fuels, the second last line, underline that. At COP27, underline that. मेरा window expand होगा. At COP27, India wanted to include a commitment to phase down all fossil fuels and not just oil and gas, including oil and gas, but the resolution failed. The resolution failed, that's a different thing, but India brought the resolution. Now the next COP, the 28th COP, which was held last year at Dubai. First, global stocktake. Global stocktake. Beta, the countries have given their NDCs. All the countries have given their NDCs to UNFCCC. And from time to time, performance monitoring of these NDCs by the countries needs to be done. Whether the countries are moving on the right path or not. So global review of NDCs needs to be done. That global review of the collective progress made by the countries is being called as global stocktake. Underline the definition. It is defined as a review of collective or global progress made by the countries towards achieving the targets of Paris Agreement. Mera window. I want my window on the board. Yeah. So this is the first global stocktake was done last year in 23, and this stocktake will be done every 5 years. So next one will be done when? In 28, right? Then the second point, transitioning away from the fossil fuels. Look at the third line in that, fossil fuel phase out. Now you understand the difference between phase out and phase down, right? So phase out has been rejected by like-minded developing countries. It is a group of 25 nations which includes India and China. The third one, phasing down of coal, received a separate mention. Understand how pressure is created on developing countries. This is exactly how pressure was created for climate action, the end of which was that Copenhagen Accord in form of climate finance. Year after year at every COP they repeat the same thing. Phase down coal, phase down coal. Har COP mein phasing down of coal is now being discussed, right? So phasing down of coal received a separate mention. There is no explicit mention of phase down of oil and natural gas. India asserts that singling out coal is discriminatory. Rather, natural gas is now being considered as a clean or a transitional fuel by countries like US. And then tripling of the renewable energy. Turn over the page. Loss and damage fund has been operationalized. ये भाई जनधन खाते में पैसे गए, right? So $725 million was pledged in this COP to this loss and damage fund. And the sixth one, now understand class. I told you under climate finance that the initial deal was that from 2020 to 2025, $100 billion will be provided every year as climate finance. So the climate finance was till 25. Now the climate finance after 25 will be called as new collective quantified goal. New collective quantified goal. The terminology is changing. It remains climate finance, but it will be called as new collective quantified goal. The countries now have to decide what after 25. The groundwork for that began here. Right? So that's the point. Simply that the groundwork for new quantified collective goal began here. Now we are through with all the COPs till now. Okay? We'll discuss India's climate action next. But before that, we'll have a look at India's energy mix. Turn over the page. Our total installed power capacity is 434 gigawatts. Look at the table, the last row of the table. 434 gigawatts. 1000 megawatt is 1 gigawatt. So over here you have in megawatts, but that is 1000 megawatt is 1 gigawatt. Beta, for a growing economy like India, these numbers change very rapidly. Every quarter, the Ministry of Power is going to update them on its website. When the handout got printed, it was still February going on. So as per February, these are the numbers. But the numbers have been revised a little. But nonetheless, even this is fine. Let's go through it. 434 gigawatt, it includes fossil and non-fossil. Fossil accounts for 56% of our energy mix. Non-fossil accounts for the remaining 44% of our energy mix. In fossil, the biggest share is that of coal. Kitna hai coal? 48.6% of our energy mix is contributed by coal. Mil raha hai handout mein? Now the non-fossil. Non-fossil includes two things. Non-fossil includes renewable and nuclear. Nuclear is a very small share right now. Simply 1.7% is nuclear. So the bulk of non-fossil is renewable. And in that renewable, acha, beta, ab dekho this boy. How much is our non-fossil right now? 190 gigawatt. अभी वो बढ़ चुका है, अराउंड 200 गीगावाट है. ठीक है, तो अब आपका वो क्वेश्चन कि मैम हाउ विल वी बिकम 500 गीगावाट बाय 2030. राइट नाउ वी आर 200 गीगावाट. तो कैसे बनेंगे 500 गीगावाट? बन जाएंगे यार, कर रहे हैं ना काम. अब लेट शुरू किया था तो लेट ही अचीव होगा. और मोर ओवर कितना अभी बीच में पैंडेमिक आ गया, सोलर एनहांस करे थे पैंडेमिक की वजह से, वो सारा हम इंपोर्ट करते हैं सोलर का इक्विपमेंट. अपने यहाँ सिर्फ असेंबली होती है मैन्युफैक्चरिंग के नाम पर. रिसर्च एंड डेवलपमेंट का तो इकोसिस्टम ही नहीं बनाया ना कभी. हाई एंड मैन्युफैक्चरिंग तो हम कर ही नहीं पाए. हमारी दिवाली की लाइटें तो चाइना से आती हैं यार, हम क्या बनाएंगे? और राइट, तो राइट नाउ रिन्यूएबल इज मोस्ट ऑफ नॉन फॉसिल. इन दैट रिन्यूएबल बच्चे सोलर इज 70, ये जो 75 गीगावाट दिया हुआ है ना, टुडे दिस इज अराउंड 93 गीगावाट. February में it was 79, 75. Right now it is around 93. Right, so there has been augmentation of capacity in the intermittent period. So that's about the India's energy mix. Now let's get back to the previous. That is one India's action. So we have given NDCs. There is a long list of NDCs. The 3 NDCs I have given over here are the ones which are related to mitigation, quantified goals of mitigation. The first one, to have cumulative electric power installed capacity from non-fossil to be 40% by 2030. क्या पड़ा? अभी कितना है हमारा? What is our non-fossil capacity right now? 44%. What was the target? 40% by 2030. So we achieved the target in advance. And whenever it comes to international affairs, India has, since independence, India has always been a responsible global player. Always. Right? So we are those good boys. तो फिर हमने कहा कि हमने अचीव कर लिया. Therefore we will revise our target. So we revised our target. खुद से. किसी ने नहीं बोला हमको रिवाइज करने को. हमने काम करेंगे. Right? तो अब क्या टारगेट है? अब है to have cumulative electric power installed capacity from non-fossil to be 50% by 2030. The second NDC, reduce emissions intensity of GDP. Now you need to write down the definition. You have some space on page 5 at the bottom, right over there. Emissions intensity of GDP is also called as emissions intensity of GDP is also called as carbon intensity of economy. Is also called as carbon intensity of economy. And now take down the formula. How do we calculate it? Take down the formula. Joshua, you have a question, ma'am. When will India eliminate its dependence on fossil fuels? Beta, we are going to become net zero in 2070. So it's not just about fossil fuels, it's about all of the sectors. When we say that we are going to become net zero in 2070, it means that till 2070 emissions are going to be there from the country. अच्छा, अब समझो इसको, please understand this one. Beta, emissions intensity of GDP is trying to calculate that for producing $1 of GDP in a country, in an economy, how much of emissions that country is making. That if I have to produce $1 of GDP in India, how much of emissions India is making. That is what is calculated through emissions intensity of GDP. And for climate action, emissions intensity of GDP should fall with time. It should reduce with time. If the ratio has to reduce with time, 2 things should happen. Denominator should increase and the numerator should decrease. Agreed? यही होना चाहिए ना? For a growing economy like India, denominator is consistently increasing. And we have made commitments to ensure that the numerator decreases. Because gradually we are definitely increasing our dependence upon non-fossil. As we increase our dependence upon non-fossil, emissions reduce over time. Right now we are 44%. Over time that is going to increase, so emissions are going to reduce. So emissions reduce, simultaneously GDP increases, therefore emissions intensity of economy starts to fall. Then we say that India is becoming less carbon intensive, or India is increasingly becoming decarbonized, or the economy is becoming less carbon intensive, or the economy is becoming decarbonized. But economy becoming decarbonized does not mean that economy is not growing. Economy can still continue to grow if from carbon to non-carbon based sources the economy has started to use. Are you guys with me on the same platform? समझ आ रही है मेरी बात? Very good. So what was the target? The target was that we will reduce the emissions intensity of GDP by 33 to 35% by 2030. We achieved that. Good boy. हमने बोला हम रिवाइज करेंगे अपना टारगेट. So what is the target now? That we will reduce emission intensity of GDP by 45% till 2030. The next one, creation of, now this third NDC is related to our forest. So what is the NDC? Creation of an additional carbon sink of 2.5 to 3 billion tons of carbon dioxide equivalent through additional forest cover. Right? This is related to our forest. Then, bache, apart from the NDC, we provided some more climate commitments in form of Panchamrit. Those are 5 points. 4 of them are up till 2030. One of them is net zero of 2070. Padhte hain unko Panchamrit ko. Some of them are NDCs only. The first one, to have non-fossil energy capacity of 500 gigawatt by 2030. Right? This is one of the Panchamrit. The next one, to have 50% of energy requirements from renewable energy by 2030. So that's same as the NDC. The third one, to reduce total projected carbon emissions by 1 billion tons from now onwards till 2030. Padho isko dobara. I have a question. Can I say third Panchamrit is actually trying to achieve the numerator of this fraction? Yes or no? What are we supposed to do in the numerator? To reduce our emissions, and what is the third Panchamrit? That we will reduce our emissions by 1 billion tons till 2030. Right? Now the fourth one is again carbon intensity, which is same as emissions intensity of GDP. So it says that we will reduce our carbon intensity of economy by 45% by 2030. And the last one is that we go net zero by 2070. These are the commitments. In order to ensure that we realize these commitments, we achieve these commitments, in the last couple of years, there have been a number of programs. The first one, which I'll discuss with you, is ethanol blending program. Ethanol blending program. Ethanol chemically is ethyl alcohol. It is chemically ethyl alcohol. It's a biofuel. Biofuel is the fuel which is derived from biomass. Biofuel is a fuel which is derived from biomass. Based upon the type of biomass used, there are different types of biofuels. We call them as first generation, second generation, third generation, fourth generation. Write down. First generation or 1G biofuels. First generation or 1G biofuels are derived from edible products rich in sugar and starch. Rich in sugar and starch, like rice, sugarcane, millets, corn and cassava. Spellings on board. And cassava. Second generation 2G, they are derived from crop residue and agriculture waste. 2G are derived from crop residue and agriculture waste. Three G from microorganisms like algae. 3G from microorganisms like algae. And 4G from genetically modified plants. Genetically modified plants with high carbon content. Genetically modified plants with high carbon content. So now there are different types of biofuels based on the feedstock. Biomass is called as feedstock. The input which is used is also called as feedstock. So based upon the feedstock, there are different types of biofuels. What India has been producing has been 1G. 1G is the simplest. It comes from edible products which are rich in sugar and starch. India has been heavily dependent upon rice and sugarcane for ethanol production till now. So most of our ethanol production has been from sugarcane. Then later on rice was used as well. So that is what is used in India. Do you guys understand cassava? You guys understand tapioca? You guys understand sabudana? Very good. वो sabudana is made from a tuber plant, आलू की तरह रहता है. That's called as tapioca in India, but globally it's called as cassava. तो एग्जाम में cassava ही लिखना है, साबुदाना नहीं लिख के आना है. फिर ब्रैकेट में लिखोगे व्रत वाला. Right? So cassava is rich in starch. Now, bache, in our country, when we use rice and sugarcane, you know that both rice and sugarcane are highly water-intensive crops, and therefore ecologically, it's not very, very wise to keep on using rice and sugarcane because they're highly water-intensive, and the groundwater reserves of the country are depleting fast. Therefore, now what is needed is that India should make a switch towards second generation. Second generation makes use of crop residue. Northern India, states like Punjab, Haryana, Northwestern UP, they have a big problem of stubble burning at the end of the Kharif season. If that crop residue, instead of being burnt on the field, now farmer is incentivized because farmer can sell that crop residue, and that crop residue is used for ethanol production, second G ethanol production, nothing like that, right? So India should gradually make a switch towards 2G ethanol because it will solve both the problems. Biofuel production will be taken care of. Along with that, stubble burning problem will be taken care of as well, right? Third G is more in the research stage. Fourth G is what I told you, that those crops which will do a lot of carbon sequestration, those plants, genetically modified plants, which will do a lot of carbon sequestration because they have a lot of carbon content. So during photosynthesis, they are going to absorb a lot of carbon from the atmosphere. Therefore, they have enhanced potential, genetically enhanced potential for carbon sequestration. That's 4G. Now, our national average, what we have achieved till now, we are around E10 to E13. You understand this terminology, E10, E13, E20, etc. What it means is that when we call it as E10, the fuel mixture has 10% ethanol and 90% gasoline, that is petrol. E20 means that the fuel mixture has 20% ethanol and remaining 80% is gasoline. Our target is to become E20 by 2025. What is the target under ethanol blending program? To become E20 by 2025. Right now, मैंने बताया we are at around E13. तो हम हो जाएंगे. By next year we'll be E20. Right? नहीं होंगे तो देखी जाएगी. हो जाएगा. कुछ तो होगा यार. So we become E20 by 2025. Write down. Advantages of ethanol blending. Advantages of ethanol blending. Write down. First point, it reduces import dependence. It reduces import dependence on crude oil. It reduces import dependence on crude oil. Next, it's a source of income diversification. It's a source of income diversification for the farmers. For the farmers. Next, it improves combustion efficiency. It improves combustion efficiency of the fuel. Combustion efficiency of the fuel, thereby reducing carbon monoxide emissions. Thereby reducing carbon monoxide emissions. Next point, biomass cultivation. Biomass cultivation for in brackets for ethanol production. Biomass cultivation in brackets for ethanol production helps in carbon sequestration. Helps in carbon sequestration. Helps in carbon sequestration. The first 2 points are economy related. You understand them. We have a high import dependence upon crude oil. Moreover, it's going to be an additional source of income for the farmers. The third and the fourth point are related to environment. Basically, ethanol has a lot of oxygen into it. When ethanol is blended with gasoline, the oxygen content of the fuel increases. Combustion efficiency improves. Higher the combustion efficiency, carbon monoxide emissions are going to reduce. Along with that, when biomass cultivation happens on the field, carbon sequestration happens then. That is why 4G came up, because 4G allows for a lot of carbon sequestration, because 4G is genetically modified plant which has a lot of carbon content into it. So where are carbon dioxide emissions offset? Carbon dioxide emissions are offset during biomass cultivation. Now, the Global Biofuel Alliance, much like International Solar Alliance, there is a Global Biofuel Alliance which says that the countries must collaborate for augmenting their biofuel capacity. So there were 3 founding members of Global Biofuel Alliance: Brazil, US and India. And Brazil, US and India are the top 3 producers of ethanol in the world. Brazil is biggest, followed by US, followed by India. So these are top three ethanol producing countries in the world. So Global Biofuel Alliance, this was announced at last year's G20 summit when India was holding the presidency. Last year in September, the summit was held. India was holding the presidency. So at that time, the announcement for G20 for Global Biofuel Alliance was made. So let the countries collaborate for augmenting their biofuel capacity. That is the objective of Global Biofuel Alliance. The next one, National Hydrogen Mission. National Hydrogen Mission.